If you have the Sony A7 IV and you still have no clue how the heck to set it up for portraits, you clicked on the right video. In this video, I'm going to go over all my camera settings and configurations I use to get amazing portraits like these, and you can literally just copy these exact settings. So if I hop into settings and start with our image quality tab, I have it set to RAW, writing to both card slots. If you're not shooting in RAW, I don't know what you're doing, but RAW is obviously going to retain the most amount of information in your photos to give you the maximum amount of flexibility when it comes to editing. You'll be able to pull a lot more colors and detail out of your image, but also preserve all the details in your shadows and highlights. Shooting in RAW does take up a lot more space, averaging about 30 to 40 MB per photo on the Sony A7 IV, but it's worth it, and I highly recommend shooting in RAW all the time. If you don't want to write RAW files to both cards, you can go down to record media settings here and change it. I have it set to simultaneous recording, which means whatever writes to the first card, it will do the same to the second. That way I always have a backup. But you can even customize it, like saving RAW files to the first card and JPEGs to the second card. Under aspect ratio, I have it set to the standard 3:2, which will be the entire screen. But if you're shooting in RAW, it actually doesn't matter which aspect ratio you shoot in, because you can always revert back to 3:2 or 3:2 in post. Those are the only settings that matter in our shooting menu for now. Now this camera has a ton of settings, so I'm gonna skip any that are not relevant to shooting portraits, or else we'd be here all day. If we go down to our exposure/color menu and down to white balance, I have mine set to 5600 Kelvin, which is daylight. I don't recommend shooting in automatic white balance because it will constantly change when shooting. So when it comes to editing, you're gonna have some photos at 4000 Kelvin and some at 5000, which will make it so much harder to deal with when editing. If you're shooting in RAW, it doesn't really matter what you have your white balance set at. As long as it's pretty neutral, you can adjust it later in post and still get accurate colors. So I would set it to 5600 Kelvin as it is the most neutral balance. Next, let's go into color tone, and under creative look, I have mine set to ST, which I believe means standard. I'll be honest, I have yet to play around with other looks, but ST has always given me a good starting point, so I haven't changed it. Next, we have our focus settings. Under our first tab here, we have our focus mode set to single shot autofocus. This actually changes. I'll show you that when we talk about my custom configurations. So right now, it doesn't matter what you set it to. Under priority set in autofocus single shot, I have it set to autofocus. Basically what this does is tell the camera what to do when you take the photo. When you click the shutter, do you want it to make sure the shot is in focus first? Or do you want to be able to take the photo regardless if it's in focus or not? So you're basically setting what you want your camera to prioritize, focus or shooting faster. So when shooting in single shot autofocus, I have it set to autofocus, which will make sure the shot is in focus. And when shooting in autofocus continuous, I want it to release without worrying if we're in focus or not. And this is because when I do shoot in autofocus continuous or AFC, it's usually when I want the autofocus to be constantly tracking. So when the model is walking towards me and I'm just holding the shutter button and hope I get one shot in focus. If I don't have it set to release anyway, then while the autofocus is trying to focus on the subject walking, it's not gonna let me fire the shutter as fast as I want it to. Now under autofocus tracking sensitivity, I have it set to 3, which is a standard and what yours is probably set at right now. I found it to be pretty responsive, but if you find that it's not tracking fast enough or not doing the best job trying to find your subject, you can always increase this number. Everything else is probably the same as what you have now. Below that, we have focus area. This is always set to wide. We'll skip everything here. Under face eye autofocus, I have it set to on because I want it to be focusing on the subject's eyes at all time. The autofocus on the Sony A7 IV is insanely good, and this will make sure that your subject is in focus 100% of the time. For subject, I have it set to human. Right left eye select is set to auto. I don't care whether the autofocus tracks the right or left eye, as long as it's tracking one of them. Now those are basically all the settings I would change if you want to start taking better portraits. But earlier in the video, I talked about setting up custom configurations, and those are going to be set to the 1, 2, and 3 numbers or modes on your top dial. This makes it super easy to change between settings on the fly. So what you want to do is click on this button here, and when the little menu pops up, you want to change your autofocus to single shot autofocus, which is AFS. Then go over to your drive mode and set that to single shot. That's one configuration I'll use when taking portraits. So I'll actually go over to my settings and set that to the number 1 mode on my custom dial. Once that configuration is assigned to the number 1 mode on our dial, we can move on to number 2. For our second configuration, I like to set it up like this. Go into your autofocus settings the same way we did first and set your autofocus to AFC. This will be autofocus continuous. Paired up with that, I have my drive mode set to continuous shooting. You can set it to continuous low, continuous mid, or continuous high. Usually mine is set to continuous mid. Once you've made those 2 adjustments, we'll go into our settings and assign that configuration we just made to our number 2 mode on our dial. Now you can switch between these different configurations or settings just by turning the dial. But what are these configurations for? How do I use them? Let me tell you. If we switch into our first mode, we have this set to single shot autofocus, which is AFS, and we have our drive mode set to single shooting. The reason for this is I want to make sure I'm nailing focus all the time when my subject is still. When my subject is still, there's no need for my autofocus to be set to AFC and constantly track or constantly try to get focus and risk missing focus. So we can have this set to AFS, and we'll know that wherever we click the shutter button or half click the shutter button and it focuses on our subject, we will be nailing focus as long as our subject doesn't move. Now let's say we're shooting and the model is sitting down, we're set to the number 1 mode on our dial, and now they get up and they want to start doing some walking shots where they're walking towards me. All we have to do is turn our dial. So that's where I like to use the second mode or that second configuration we made, because our autofocus is set to continuous, which means as our subject is walking towards us, our autofocus is going to be doing the work to constantly track that subject. We also have our drive mode set to continuous shooting. That way we can actually hold the shutter instead of clicking and clicking and clicking. We can just hold the shutter and it'll constantly keep shooting. So to simplify these configurations I made, if you're shooting a still subject, then set your mode to number 1. And if you're shooting a moving subject, set your mode to number 2. And that's it. That's how I have the Sony A7IV set up to shoot amazing portraits like these. If you enjoyed the video or you found it useful, make sure to hit that like button. It really does help the channel grow. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and hit that bell to be notified when I post a new video. And I'll see you in the next one.